Good morning, good early morning to Scott, and good morning to other friends. And this is Maurong Jiang, a host of the Reporting Live from Abroad. And Reporting Live from Abroad is a short program, 25 minutes. It features experts, specialists who live, work in foreign land, and they will give us the real-time reporting regarding sensitive issues or issues of interest to all of us. And I thank you all for coming to the program. Today, we are very fortunate to have one of my best friends who now lives and works in Malaysia for several years. And his name is Scott Jordan. He graduated from Creighton University. He got his master program degree from the East-West Center that Dr. Jimmy Yuan and I organized quite a few years ago. Scott Jordan is a philosopher and political scientist affiliated with the Asian World Center at Creighton. That was quite a few years ago. He serves as the executive assistant director of the Center for Post-Normal Policy and Future Studies. In addition to his academic roles, Scott Jordan has experience as a speechwriter and advised to the Prime Minister of Malaysia. He participated many Asian Culture Week at Creighton University. Scott Jordan is also a regular contributor to the quarterly publication, Critical Muslim, where he explores various topics related to politics, culture, and society. He also published a book that he will introduce briefly. He's a member of the Non-Killing Consortium International and has collaborated with the Song Qingling Foundation in China. Jordan has co-edited works such as Muslim Societies in Post-Normal Times, Foresights for Trends, Emerging Issues and Scenarios, which examines the complexities and challenges faced by Muslim societies in contemporary time. This is just a rough introduction of Scott, but he has much more information that I didn't include. But from his talk, you can tell how knowledgeable he is. Basically, he can talk every subject that we always ask him to do. So without further ado, please welcome Scott Jordan. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Maurong. Thanks to everyone for putting this together and having me here. As a way of an introduction, now, Maurong, is this more of an audio sort of program, or will people be able to see as well?
Yes, people can see. If you have PowerPoint, you can show with me.
Oh, I don't really have a PowerPoint, but I wanted to use a couple images just to kind of to orient us, I suppose, as it were. So not a lot of people know about Malaysia. So I think if it's possible, I am going to share. Yes, okay. Let's see if I can. Yes, I can. Okay. So I like maps. I'm very geographical. So I'm going to use that as a way to kind of tell the narrative that I want to talk about, because especially when we're discussing multiculturalism and different cultures, identities, peoples coming together, it kind of helps to see how we all fall together on Earth, as it were. So here's, of course, I think where many of you are in the US. So just going to kind of zoom out, and then we can go way across the ocean here. We'll say hi to Maurong in Hawaii. and then come to, the great, or, the massive continent of Asia here. So, usually I prefer to actually do this on a chalkboard because as you draw it out, you kind of get an idea of where all these things are. And so of course, we have Russia up here, China, which spent a lot of time focusing on during my master's time, but now I'm residing in this little area here, called Malaysia. And so a little introduction to Malaysia, because again, it may not be a place you're very familiar with. It is a peninsula, so here as well, and it is also the northern third, I suppose, of Borneo, which is one of the largest islands on the planet. I think it's number three. But I may be wrong on that, but it is one of the largest islands on the planet. It's often confused with this other island nation known as Indonesia, which is all around here, minus Papua New Guinea and then there's a lot of disputed territory. We hear a lot about the disputed territories in the South China Sea, between the Philippines here, the massive island nation, as well as Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. So a lot of that all is taking place in here. So a bit about Malaysia. Why I guess I'll begin with the people. There's actually a lot of prehistoric paleontological evidence for peoples having been here for uh, going way, way back, pre-civilization. And many of the people who lived on these island areas were seafaring people and could kind of hop around, as it were. And so there was a lot of cross-cultural mixing, as you can imagine. Once China started to emerge as a civilization, as well as, and same for India and Siam, which is now known as Thailand. When these areas started emerging, that's when you started getting a lot of trade via the oceans, which a lot of people talk about. We know the Silk Road because you might have heard of the Road and Belt Initiative that China's working on, which is this trade network that kind of connects China to the world using the old ancient trade routes. These trade routes were not always by land. We have to also recognize that they're by sea. And there's a lot more research going into that nowadays. You can find a lot of books looking on that. William Dalrymple's new book, that of course I'm drawing a blank on the title of that, The Golden Something, explores this and the intricacies of the different civilizations that were popping up around the coastlines here. So back to Malaysia. Why is this part of the world important? We know why China is important. We know why India is important. And this is just what's kind of in the middle. And I think in contemporary times, we wonder, between two major powers, India, China, and even the US on the far side of the Pacific, do these guys really have that much say or power, or what can they actually do? Well, an important thing to note is that China has two major trade routes to get to the West or to Europe, since especially when there's problems getting across the Pacific to the US with some of the tariffs going on. They can go north and up and basically over Russia, especially when they have good relations with Russia. But the problem with that trade route, as many of you might be experiencing in Omaha right now, is that freezes over for a good portion of the year. Now, maybe global warming is working to their advantage, and so they would actually benefit from that area, the ice caps melting there, and those seaways being open year round. But when they can't get through there, there is a very important shipping lane here known as the Straits of Malacca, which is right in here, which is down around, so Singapore, the small island nations right here, and all that trade has to go down and through the Straits of Malacca, which is one of the oldest and most heavily trafficked trade routes in the world these days. So it actually makes it a very important place. and an important place to be secure, because there have been lots of pirate activity in history from that. And if there's tensions between Malaysia and Indonesia, which has existed in the past, that makes this trade route very problematic. So Malaysia, where did it come from? So we can say Malaysia, Indonesia, even the Philippines were all part of one civilization, and we can call it Brunei as well, the Kingdom of Brunei, the Malay world. A lot of these people would have been considered Malays at one point in time. Of course, colonialism and a history of um, identities and evolution and people drawing lines in the sand, that changes things. So Indonesia largely had been colonized by the Portuguese, and then the Dutch. The Portuguese had also colonized Malaysia, but then they had lost out to the Dutch for a brief period, and then the British had actually taken over most of what is Malaysia. Um, Brunei managed to maintain some independence, and of course, the island of Borneo here has been split down the middle between Indonesia and Malaysia. Essentially, to make a long story short, years of colonialism, borders have been drawn up. Malaysia was sort of a segment of kingdoms. So there are 9 sultans in Malaysia, and they trade off every 5 years being the king of kings. It just every 5 years they cycle through, and it's the same cycle. Then they say that there's an election, but they tend to follow the same order of sultans unless one's too young or there's a problem with one, or one's too old or something along those lines. But generally, it's followed that trend. And there's an old joke because Mahathir Mohamad was prime minister for about 20 years in Malaysia. And so the joke was Malaysia is the only country where we elect our kings and our prime ministers serve for life. So, but nowadays that's obviously changed somewhat, and everything's supposed to be on 5-year cycles, 5-year parliamentary elections, and then 5-year the Agong, or the King of Kings, is elected in that regards. So going back to where does Malaysia come from? So Malaysia is very interesting because it has 2 Independence Days, if you will, 2 national holidays. The first one is the 31st of August. That was when Malaysia had declared independence from the British, or it was called Malaya back then. Then in 1963, something very interesting happened. Malaya was going at it by itself, as was Singapore, which was still a protectorate of the British. Sarawak and Sabah, which are the East territories over here on Borneo, they were all British protectorates as well. And so when the British basically wanted to cut their losses in Southeast Asia, they had formulated a plan in London known as the Malaysia Agreement that would create a super country, if you will, of Malaya, which is the peninsula, Singapore, Sarawak, and Sabah, which worked quite well. And the whole point was this is to be a super state that stands against the rise of communism. Of course, it's the Cold War. After World War II, there was lots of fear of the spread of communism in Asia because of China, because of what had happened in Vietnam, Cambodia as well. And so the idea was to build this stalwart state. Now, Malaysia was kind of handed its independence, which wasn't something that Indonesia was terribly happy about, because Indonesia had to fight pretty tooth and nail, and it was a very brutal war for independence for them. And they wanted to be they didn't really care for the West, and they didn't really care for the communists. And so they wanted to be in between. And so they saw Malaysia as a threat, as basically a puppet state, a Western puppet state in Southeast Asia. And so they had declared what was the confrontasi, or the confrontation, as it's translated, which was a mini war that broke out between these 2 places. Now, Indonesia and Malaysia both have many different ethnic makeups that comprise the people. Difference being, Indonesia had Suharto and Sukarno, and they had a really rough fight for independence. And so there's this idea of Indonesia as because it was always, it was never this notion of, it was always the Dutch East Indies, right? Indonesia was this new independent state. They had an identity, and they just whatever religion you want to practice is what you want to practice, but Indonesian is our identity. And that was kind of the way that went. Malaysia went a little bit differently. It was not so much that Malaysia began with an identity. Malaysia, if you break down the word, means land of the Malays. Now, when we look at Malaysia, typically there's always been a majority of Malays living in Malaysia. But when they added Singapore, Singapore had a lot of Chinese ethnic descendant people. And then Sarawak and Sabah have a whole, they call them Dayak generally, but many indigenous identities, Iban, Kadazan, many of those. And within their own states, they sometimes have their own identities as well. So another thing that had happened during the time that the British had colonized Malaysia, they had brought in a lot of foreign workers from China and India. Well, so actually, let me take that back a little bit further. As this center of trade, right, global trade, we can take this almost back to prehistory, essentially. We're talking ancient Chinese kingdoms and some of the early Indian kingdoms that had risen. People had been coming through this area for thousands of years, right? So there's going to be a mix of people. And actually, as it turns out, there are some Chinese that people of Chinese descendants that have been living in Malaysia, Malaya, Malacca, whatever it was referred to at that point in time, for generations. But then there were influxes, particularly during the British time, where they brought in Indians and Chinese for specific purposes. So Indians were brought in to work the plantations, Chinese were brought in to work the mines. Indians were also made to be sort of the security force or the police force. Chinese were brought in to help establish certain banks and financial sectors. And meanwhile, the Malays were just there, and there had been a lot of intermarrying as well, so it makes it quite confusing. So it's an interesting situation. So at the time of independence in 57, you had a pretty even mix. And from the perspective of the Malays, that was a bit of a threat to them because you have the Chinese in their mind could always go back to China, even though the Chinese themselves would never see foreign-born Chinese quite the same. And likewise for the Indians as well, because many of the Indians were South Indians, and with the rise of kind of North Indian power, especially in the post-colonial era, the idea of these populations going back home is somewhat ridiculous, but you might see some parallels with how we talk about things in the United States to a certain extent. And so the whole point, the thesis I want to kind of draw to is that you see this different makeup, but very similar problems with racism and ethnic balance in given societies. And so what I'd argue is that Malaysia, like the United States, very multicultural. They have a lot of different ethnic descendancies, cultural makeups that build our communities. There have been many efforts in the terms of Benedict Anderson, these artificial or imagined identities or communities that are brought together and sort of placed on top of things. But there hasn't been what I would argue what you might argue as plurality, right? So plurality, I think, is when diverse peoples live together in somewhat of a harmonious style. But multiculturalism is just where you have that multiculturalism, multiple ethnic identities. So between Malaysia and the United States, I'd argue you have multiculturalism, but plurality is still a dream that's quite a ways away, as we see in uh, contemporary politics in the United States or in Malaysia. Race is still a huge issue here as well. Many of the ethnic Indians, or sometimes the ethnic Chinese as well, are similar to how Black communities or Hispanic communities in the United States are treated. But there's sort of a reverse as far as or what you might call white populations and Malay populations in the two respective countries, because there's the privilege of white communities, but then the opposite is said for Malays, where Malays don't have the privilege. So in the Constitution of Malaysia, there's actually a clause that gives privilege to Malay populations. which would sounds really weird, I think, if you don't know it from the outside. But when you understand the history, the whole idea was to try. Malays had always been called the lazy native, and the idea was to try to overcome that false label and to lift the people up. And so but it's been very difficult because, we know that affirmative action doesn't work. And that's a policy that Malaysia tried. It's a policy the United States tried. And you still see the same disparities. So you try for equality, but you miss that really the focus should have been equity, right? Is on you have to find a way to balance and equal everything out, not just assume that you can just wipe the slate clean and there's no history. That the history is very important in all of that. So I've been going on. I didn't know if there was any questions. I might stop sharing for the time being. But beyond that, oh, sorry, let me throw a few numbers to kind of help that out. So right now, Malaysian population is around 35 million. 70.4% of that is what we call Bumi Putra. Now, Bumi Putra translates to sons of the soil or native people. Malays are included in this, as are the indigenous communities in Sarawak and Sabah, and the Orang Asli, which are like the Native American equivalent of Malaysia, even predating the Malays. And there's a big debate about where did the Malays come from? What is a Malay? These things are very prescient questions today. Just like you might argue, well, what does it mean to be a white person or a black person in the UK or the US or something along those lines? Then at 22.4% are ethnic Chinese and 6.5% are ethnic Indians. So you kind of see the breakdown that was happening of that. And of course, I didn't even mention that Singapore. So in 1963, Singapore was part of Malaysia, but in 1965, they had been basically kicked out. The problem being Singapore threw off the Chinese numbers. In fact, in the 60s, because of the massive influx of Chinese workers by the British Empire and Indian workers, it was almost the portion that was Indian and Chinese were almost equal. There was like a almost 40-40 split there with the remainder being all the other different populations. And so, Cold War, what do we associate Chinese ethnics with? Communism. There was where a lot of the fear came. And so unfortunately, Singapore was kicked out for a variety of reasons, but I think a large part of it was that being a large ethnic Chinese bloc in Malaysia, removing them would help rebalance the Malay population in the country. There was also some weird things going on between Lee Kuan Yew and Tunku Abdul Rahman, who was the first prime minister of Malaysia, as well as things going on with the war with Indonesia, the confrontasi, and ongoing Cold War. So it's a very complex issue. So I'm sort of simplifying it, but you see that throughout the history of Malaysia, there have always been these racial issues. And then in 1969, May 13th is very well known. It's known for something we don't talk about. It's almost the equivalent of Tiananmen Square for Malaysia, because there was a horrible race riot that broke out a few days after the general election that year, when there was a fear that there was going to be non-Malay leaders in some of the states and a disbalance in the proportions of parliament, because it's always been that there should be approximately 2/3 Malay and 1/3 everyone else in parliament in order to maintain the balance and order, and that had been thrown off. Riots broke out. People were literally killing each other in the streets here in Kuala Lumpur and throughout the whole country. Very nasty stuff. Right on because there's an old community in Kuala Lumpur here in the capital that you have a Malay village and a Chinese village, and they meet on one street, and literally there was just people, they didn't have guns back then, so it was literally just taking knives and stabbing and chopping and very horrendous stuff that people don't quite know about, because it's a sort of a shameful piece of history. But because of that, there's when you don't face those problems, they always kind of remain at some level. So this has always been a big issue. And so I just wanted to kind of explain to you nowadays things are much better. Obviously, there's lots of people trying to work on racial harmony, but the racial problem in Malaysia is very much the same that we see in the United States. And we see it in lots of other countries, even the countries we think of as being very monochromatic. They have, people always like to pick at the differences and find ways to hate each other. And it's really too bad. So I hope it's something we can talk more about and try to overcome and get from being multicultural societies, which is going to happen with increased globalization as we continue moving and living all over the world. But how do we get from that multiculturalism to true plurality, which is where together we can unite and progress towards brighter futures. So with that, I think I'm hitting the 25-minute mark, so I don't want to go too far over Norong's
Thank you
limit.
so much, Scott. Thank you so much, Scott. And also thanks to Vicky, Betty, and Sonia. Very happy that you can join us this early morning in Malaysia.
Yeah.
Well, we do have a few minutes to stretch out for questions.
Mm.
It's a fantastic talk. That's exactly what I expect you, Scott.
Oh, good, good. Okay.
You never disappoint me at least, or all the audience. So, and we will see him again and again many times. He has been a speaker numerous times at Creighton, and I'm glad that this is the first time Scott, talks from Malaysia that he's right now walking and living. Um, yeah, Betty, go ahead.
Um, it's good to see you, Scott.
Yeah, good to see you too. How are you?
Thank you for doing this. I missed the beginning. I apologize for that. I was busy all morning. So anyway, I have a question, but you may have said something earlier, but I just want to clear that in my mind. Is Indonesia considered all the little countries around, or what exactly? When you say Indonesia, is that all the little countries combined, like the United States with all the
Right.
other states?
Right. It's so you have this archipelago, and here let me actually pull up the map. It's easier to explain this on a map. So that's why I had that. Okay. So when we look at this, so here we have what I mean, it is Southeast Asia, right? So we
Yeah.
have Australia, India, China, and in the middle here you have these countries. They're part of a geopolitical pact as well called ASEAN. And Malaysia is about to take over the chair of ASEAN next year, so that's everyone's pretty excited about that here. So what does it mean exactly? Well, it would be like having the SecGen coming from your country. Although the SecGen is there is a SecGen of ASEAN, and it's more so just a figurehead who just makes sure we keep to the minutes and keep on time and everything. But as far as power goes, it's not really a powerful position. So so Malaysia is this peninsula as well as half of Borneo here. Indonesia is I'm not as good at Indonesia and Philippines as I should be, but I'm not sure who has more islands. It might be the Philippines, I think, because the Philippines I think has literally
2000.
thousands of islands. Yeah.
2000.
2000, yeah. And then Indonesia has a lot of different islands, but some of them are kind of combined. And so what the difference is, all these people were sort of, well, I shouldn't say the same. Many of these people are of similar ethnicity. They call them so like the people from Borneo, actually the people from Borneo, Philippines, and Taiwan indigenously are all the same, which is kind of interesting. Of course, Taiwan, I'm sure you've heard other people tell about the history of that, where poor Taiwan's been taken over by everyone over the course of history, unfortunately. And it's been a rough ride for the indigenous people, unfortunately, which there aren't very many of anymore. But then you have what are you could call this all the Malay, it's called the Malay archipelago in history, because the people were known as Malays. Now, what is a Malay? I could give a 3-hour lecture on what a Malay is and you still wouldn't know. So it's a very complicated ethnicity slash it's the only ethnicity that constitutionally in Malaysia you are Muslim. That's part of the ethnicity. It's like normally you wouldn't associate a religion with an ethnicity, but it's what happens in Malaysia with that. So yeah, the primary difference between Malaysia and Indonesia, although historically it's one entity, and often Malaysia claims, like Jose Rizal, right, is the national hero of the Philippines, but Malaysia claims it. He's a Malayan hero because it's the Malay world, right? But because of colonialism, Malaysia, ports of Borneo were first, actually, well, frankly, all this was controlled by the Portuguese first, and then the Spanish got the Philippines, the Dutch got Indonesia, and the British got what is Malaysia, essentially. And then of course the Japanese took all of this in the 1940s. And there's a fun story about that because the Japanese actually had a plan to give them all independence, but then the bomb dropped on Hiroshima and unconditional surrender. So all those colonies were freed. Well, of course, the old Western colonies wanted their colonies back, so they came back in, and it took many of these nations another 10 years to get their independence after World War II because of that. So, and because of that, that's why you have these weird identities that I think, because Benedict Anderson talks a lot about Southeast Asia in his stuff, and the whole notion of imagined communities, you really see that here. I mean, you see it all throughout the global South, if you will, or the non-Western world, but in particular, that's sort of the idea. So did that answer your question? Sorry.
I think so. I mean, at least I have an idea of, the map and all that. Because when people talk about Malaysia, I always think, well, is that Indonesia? Is that in that circle? What? Thank you for explaining all that. I mean,
No problem. Yeah, it's difficult when because when you're asked to say, okay, where is it on a map, you don't realize. And also there's a huge population difference, right? There's only 35 million people in Malaysia. And there's 335 million in the United States, I think, thereabouts, a little bit less. And then of course, Indonesia has one of the largest populations in the world. So at almost 1 billion people, I think, if not pretty close. So
Great. Thanks for the question and answer. Both are excellent. Well, this something has been in my mind. I would like to share with Betty, Vicky, and Sonia, and Scott does not know it either. I'm planning to talk with Scott Jordan to have a Scott Jordan World Affairs series, 25 minutes regularly on questions about various countries. So that would be very rich and very resourceful. So I give Betty a surprise, I guess, as always.
I'm always last to know. It's okay.
No, because our speaker is right here, so it's an honor to mention that I've been thinking to have him to have Scott Jordan World Affairs series, 25 minutes talk, and anyone who wants to stay for 25 or longer, up to them. But our program will cut at exactly 25. Actually, I have not been able to do it. It's still on the recording. So let me stop the recording. Thank you very much again, Scott. So let me continue after the recording stop.